Gnostic literature is, at least at first glance, rather puzzling. For instance, if one were to pick up a copy of the Nag Hammadi library in either the Meyer or the Robinson edition, one would be confronted with hundreds of pages of literature, but no real idea where to begin studying it. Some titles seem vaguely familiar, like the Prayer of the Apostle Paul, or the various Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, Philip, or Mary, or perhaps even the Acts of Peter. While other texts appear downright strange, like the Discourse of the Ogdoad to the Ennead or the Trimorphic Protanoia. Yeah, Trimorphic Protanoia. Completely clear. And of course, that's not to mention that many of these texts are filled with long, complicated, and obscure mythologies, words that are incredibly unusual, long strings of vowels for some reason, and many texts are sadly mere fragments. It's honestly overwhelming, and it's very natural to ask, where in the world do I begin studying this vast corpus that we now call Gnostic literature? In this episode of Esoterica, I want to offer an answer to just that question. In my opinion, the best place to start studying Gnostic literature is a text called the Secret Book of John, or sometimes referred to as the Apocryphon of John. Now, while the Apocryphon of John is, at least in my opinion, one of the best places to start studying Gnostic literature, that doesn't at all indicate that it's going to be a walk in the park. However, I think by studying the Apocryphon of John rather closely, one does get some appreciation of what we might call Gnostic mythology and the overall tenor of the kind of literature that one might encounter in something like the Nag Hammadi Library or the Bruce Codex. Further, I think by studying the Apocryphon of John, one does get some sense of the overall tenor of what we might call Gnostic Christianity, although again, I have to say that with some degree of caveats. Also, I think what's interesting about the Apocryphon of John is that it disrupts some of the stereotypes often grouped with the idea of Gnosticism. So I hope you'll join me as we explore the Secret Book of John, or the Apocryphon of John, a foundational text of what scholars now refer to as Gnosticism. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. As you may know, Gnosticism is a bit of a fraught category in the academic study of religion these days. While it's popularly held that there existed an ancient religion called Gnosticism, of which there were Jewish, Christian, and even later Islamic variants, that very category, Gnosticism, has come under sustained academic attack in the past several years. So much so that there's a very strong scholarly current which rejects the existence of a historical religion called Gnosticism and basically claims that there were no such thing as Gnostics. They were simply Christians that had a very specific way of doing Christianity that we now, as scholars, call Gnostic, but they themselves, in fact, never refer to themselves as such. Now, I think this is an incredibly important debate, and understanding just what we refer to when we call something Gnostic is an incredibly important part of academic scholarship on the history of religions, and I'm going to cover that debate in a future episode. With that debate in mind, I just want to say that I'm going to be using the term Gnosticism and Gnostic quite provisionally through the course of our exploration of the Apocryphon of John, and typically when I'm using those words, I'm using them somewhat under the rubric developed by Vanderbroek, which is currently on the screen. I'll talk about his book toward the end of the episode and why I think his introduction to Gnosticism is one of the best out there, so stay tuned to the end to learn more about that. With that caveat in place, we can ask the question, what is the Apocryphon, or the Secret Book of John? Well, simply put, it's a kind of gospel. That is to say, a text providing good news about the salvation of human beings. While the typical Gospels of the New Testament take the form of biographies of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the Apocryphon of John is rather different. In fact, it acts as a kind of continuation of the Gospel of John found in the New Testament. Here, in what appears to be the period after the resurrection of Jesus, John the Apostle is being taunted by a Pharisee about the very teachings of Jesus. Distraught, John actually retreats into the desert, and it's there that the sky is torn asunder and the resurrected Jesus provides John a secret teaching. That secret teaching, or apocryphon, revealed to John by the resurrected divine Jesus, is the subject of the text we'll be exploring today. But before turning to the contents of the Apocryphon of John, let's talk about the text itself. It actually survives in a whopping 4 Coptic manuscripts that date from roughly the 3rd to the 5th centuries. As you may know, Coptic is the final form of the ancient Egyptian language, originally written in hieroglyphics, but eventually translated into various other scripts, including hieratic and demotic, and eventually being written in the Greek script. So basically, Coptic is the Egyptian language being written in the Greek script, with a couple of extra letters thrown in from the Demotic alphabet. Now, I know that 4 manuscripts doesn't sound like a lot, but when you consider that virtually no intact canonical gospel manuscripts survive from this same period, along with very few copies of the Iliad and Odyssey, one is confronted with the reality that it is positively shocking that 4 independent copies of the Apocryphon of John survive from late classical antiquity. Further, it seems like the text was originally written in Greek and then translated multiple times into Coptic. We have slight dialectical differences in the translations that have survived into Coptic. Now, the fact that the text has been translated from Greek into Coptic several times tells us that there was some demand for people to read this text in their indigenous language, the language of Egypt, which tells us that the text was quite popular. The text itself survives in 2 different recensions, a longer and shorter version. The longer version includes a long list of demons that are responsible for the construction of the primordial atom, taken from an alleged book of Zoroaster, along with a hymn of providence or pronoia, which I'll talk about later, appended to the very end of the text. It's also worth noting that the various versions of the Apocryphon of John don't always exactly agree. For instance, in the Berlin Codex, which was discovered in the 19th century, there's an important note that the distinction between men and women, specifically the subordination of women to men, was actually instituted by the hideous pseudo-god Yaldabaoth. And so in that version, we have a very interesting idea that patriarchy itself is an unjust form of social relation instituted by a false god. A not minor point if you're, a woman. So if you want to study the Apocryphon of John very closely, you'll want to do a kind of comparative analysis of the various versions that survive. I'll talk about those different versions toward the end and where you can study them each independently or together synoptically if you choose. So let's turn to the question of how to date the Apocryphon of John, which is challenging. The shorter recension of the Apocryphon of John is typically thought by scholars to be the earlier version, and there are even a current among scholarship to take that the framing device using the Apostle John is in fact later accretion onto an earlier, perhaps even pre-Christian Gnostic text. So the core of the text is perhaps the earliest section, and then there is a kind of Christian bookend put on at the beginning and the end, although there's a lot of debate about just the degree to which that's true. The earliest discussion of what we take to be the contents of the text can be found on the detection and the overthrow of so-called knowledge, or gnosis. This text is typically referred to in the Latin as Adversus Haereris, and it was written by the Proto-Orthodox bishop Irenaeus sometime around 180 of the Common Era. Now, this all points to a very important factor in thinking about the popularity of the Apocryphon of John: location. What's really fascinating about the fact that the 4 Coptic manuscripts that survive were likely produced in Egypt, what's interesting is that we have Irenaeus writing his book against the Apocryphon of John all the way over in Gaul, what is now France. The fact that 4 different manuscripts have survived, and the fact that Irenaeus attacks the text with such vigor, tells us, given the geographic range of the text being found in France all the way to Egypt, and the fact that he feels the need to attack it with such vigor, tells us that this text was in fact rather popular. So while the Apocryphon of John was not authoritative through the entire rise and development of Christianity through the ages, there's no doubt that at least in this very early period that the text was very popular and widely read. So as I mentioned earlier, the very core of the text may even predate Christianity. We have a rough idea for when the text of the Apocryphon of John was produced as we know it. The Gospel of John we typically think was composed sometime around 100 of the Common Era, And if we have Irenaeus arguing against the Apocryphon of John around 180 or 185 of the Common Era, so it makes some sense that the version of the Apocryphon of John, perhaps as we know it, was being composed sometime between roughly 100 of the Common Era and 185, around the time perhaps that Irenaeus begins to argue against it. Now, the Coptic translations which have actually survived to this day probably date to a much later period, perhaps the 3rd century. In fact, when we look at the Nag Hammadi library, inside of the cartonnage of some of those codices, the cartonnage is simply the packing material that's used to make the covers a bit stronger, there's actually a date, several dates in fact, inside of the cartonnage of those codices, and the latest date there is 348 of the Common Era. So that gives us a rough sense about when the Coptic text would have been produced and when the Apocryphon of John, at least as we know it in the Coptic editions that survive, would have been produced. There's also some good reason to believe that the Berlin Codex, the one discovered in the 19th century, actually the first manuscript discovered of the Apocryphon of John, actually dates to a slightly later period. But again, if one wants to study the Apocryphon of John in all of its various versions and all of its various recensions, it's going to be very important to study all 4 manuscripts and their translations, if that's possible. Now, if you think the question of when the Apocryphon of John is vexing, just wait till we get to who wrote it. That is the really difficult question to answer. As I mentioned earlier, the core mythological section of the text may in fact be pre-Christian. There are elements of Middle Platonic philosophy along with Jewish mythology to be found in that central text. Now, of course, this is perplexing because if you read the text, it's very clear that the author of the text does not like the Israelite God of Genesis. In fact, that God is not a God at all in the Apocryphon of John. It's a kind of pseudo-God, an evil, malevolent entity. So the writer of the text certainly knows some Jewish literature. They might even be Jewish, although their relationship with Judaism is, well, let's call it complicated. The kind of literary, philosophical, and religious sophistication of the text points in the direction of somewhere like Alexandria in Egypt. It's there that we have a highly syncretistic community of intellectual pursuits, ranging from everything from the indigenous traditional religion of Egypt through Judaism to Hermeticism, and a wide variety of philosophical movements, including Middle Platonism and Stoicism. However, the text as we have it now is eminently Christian, and I really want to put a very fine point on this. The people that wrote, edited, and composed the text as we know it would have identified primarily as Christian, much more so as Christian than, for instance, as Gnostic. And that's part of the reason why, by the way, this term Gnostic and Gnosticism has come under scholarly criticism in recent years. The fact that we refer to these texts as Gnostic should not in any way overshadow the fact that the people who took these teachings to be authoritative and salvific were fundamentally pious Christians. While Orthodox Christianity was the one that ultimately won the day, so to speak, that shouldn't at all diminish this fact. These texts were being read and studied for their salvific value by Christians. So it's clear that the version of the Apocryphon of John that survived, the one that we have in the various 4 manuscripts that have come down to us, are fundamentally Christian texts, even though they may be composed of pre-Christian or para-Christian literatures that have been edited together into one volume. But regardless, that's about all we can say about who wrote it. It seems to be composed of several different volumes in a highly educated intellectual and spiritual milieu, perhaps Alexandria, by a community of Christians who are looking to text and teaching like this for their salvific character. So, just what is the salvific secret teaching to be found in the Apocryphon of John? Well, let me begin by saying that any attempt to summarize this text is going to basically fail. Every single sentence in this text is so packed with information that it's going to be impossible for me to accurately summarize the teachings of this text. There's simply no substitution for you go and studying the text yourself. However, I'm going to venture the impossible and try to summarize this incredibly difficult text. The text begins with a kind of negative theological account of an utterly transcendent alien god, who through knowing itself produces a secondary being called the Barbelo. Just what Barbelo means is incredibly mysterious. With the combination of the ineffable ultimate father god and the mother Barbelo god, a third kind of being is produced, and that is the divine Christ, or autogenes, the self-created one. Further semi-divine entities emanate or flow from the relationship of the transcendent Father, the Mother, and the divine Christ in the form of syzygies, or pairs, and these various pairs are typically attendant to either the Barbelo or Christ. Altogether, the syzygies, along with the divine trinity of the transcendent Father, the Barbelo, and the Christ, form the pleroma, or the divine fullness. This fullness is populated by a range of divine beings or semi-divine beings called aeons, and the last of those aeons to be produced is wisdom in the form of Sophia. Sophia, or divine wisdom, seeks to emulate the Father and desires to create things on her own, and her desire to create things without the consent of her partner aeon produces a kind of cosmic disaster. From this unbalanced desire emerges a hideous, nightmarish entity referred to as Yaldabaoth. Exactly what Yaldabaoth means is a bit clear. I tend to think that it may come from a phrase coming from Hebrew, something like Yeled Bohu, which might mean something like the child of chaos. At any rate, this hideous monstrosity is expelled from the pleroma by Sophia and is sort of alone on its own. Now, because this hideous entity has some amount of divine power in it, and because it has a vague memory of being in the pleroma, the fullness of the divine world, it seeks to create its own kind of micro-pleroma, or its own kind of universe. And that universe it creates is a kind of inversion of the pleroma, and Yaldabaoth then proceeds to populate that inverted reality with all kinds of demonic entities. These demonic entities include a wide range of rather nasty beings, including the archons, or the leaders of the cosmic world, and these are typically identified with the various kinds of celestial bodies. And it's here in the text, with this cosmic disaster of Sophia producing Yaldabaoth, and Yaldabaoth creating this kind of inverted, horrifying reality, that the text of the Apocryphon of John really begins to show its genius by re-spinning the original Genesis creation story to be found in the Hebrew Bible and the Torah, by showing that the God of that creation story, the God of Genesis, is in fact none other than the nightmarish entity known as Yaldabaoth, the child of chaos. It's at this point in the secret teaching that Yaldabaoth declares that itself is basically the only God. It says, "I am a jealous God, there are none other before me," only to be immediately corrected from the pleroma itself, which says, hey, look, you're not the only thing, there is this other thing that exists, the human being. And this human being from the pleroma is actually reflected in some sense in the nightmarish, chaotic waters of the primordial creation of Yaldabaoth. After seeing the divine primordial man reflected in those initial chaotic waters, Yaldabaoth and its various demons attempt to create a kind of psychic copy of that Adam, or that human being. However, they fail to actually animate the being. And this is where the Mother Father, or Barbelo, along with the Transcendent Father, actually tricks Yaldabaoth into breathing in some of its latent divinity into the primordial Adam, or the primordial human being, thus animating it in some sense, tricking Yaldabaoth and transferring some of its power, which again originally comes from the divine realm via Sophia, into the divine human being. It's then that Yaldabaoth realizes that it's been tricked and actually casts the psychic body of the Adam, the divine human being, into the furthest depths of matter. In fact, it casts the first human being into a kind of garden of delight. The word Eden, from Garden of Eden, actually means delight. And in the Apocryphon of John, the Garden of Eden is actually meant to be a physical trap in which physical pleasure, specifically the pleasures of the body, are meant to forever trap the body, the psychic body, and the physical body of Adam in this garden. So the Garden of Eden itself is not meant to be a paradise, according to the Apocryphon of John, but a kind of prison. At the moment of being cast down into this physical prison of the Garden of Eden, the divine transcendent Father takes pity on the primordial human being and places inside of them a kind of divine being, epinoia, which will later allow them to reach salvation. Of course, this enrages Yaldabaoth, and Yaldabaoth attempts to cut into the physical body of the Adam to extract epinoia. Of course, epinoia has already fled back in the divine realm, and it's in that process that Yaldabaoth actually creates a kind of physical double of epinoia in the form of life, or Chava, our word that gets translated as Eve. So Eve is a kind of physical mirror, in some sense, of the divine epinoia. Of course, the Apocryphon of John continues to riff in this really amazing way on the Genesis creation story, where in the Genesis creation story, the human beings are told not to eat of the tree of knowledge, and when they eat of the tree of knowledge, it actually condemns them for having rebelled against God. However, in the Apocryphon of John, it is precisely because that they disobey Yaldabaoth, they eat from the tree of knowledge, that they gain understanding of their plight, and it is there that they can begin the process of working toward their own salvation, escaping the prison that is the Garden of Eden, and eventually making their way back to the divine Pleroma. So in the Apocryphon of John, the Garden of Eden story is not a fall from grace, but it is in fact a kind of a liberation, or at least the process, the start of a liberation from the prison of the physical world back into the divine Pleroma. After their expulsion from the garden, Yaldabaoth actually sexually assaults Chava, or life, and this produces two demonic entities which rule over the physical human body. These roughly correlate to Cain and Abel. Despite these demonic powers ruling over the physical body, Adam, the primordial human being, and Chava, life, do engage in sexual intercourse and produce a son, Seth. And it is Seth, produced through their conjunction, is the spiritual ancestor of all those that achieve knowledge about the truth of the physical reality, and thus, in some sense, Seth is the line through which this type of epinoia, or this type of salvific knowledge, is going to flow. Seth, in some sense, becomes the spiritual heir of all Gnostics. In fact, this type of Gnosticism is sometimes referred to as Sethian Gnosticism for this emphasis on the character of Seth. It's here in the text that John actually interrupts the ongoing revelation from Jesus to ask about the ultimate fate of the salvation history of all human beings. And there's good news. I mean, it's a gospel. In the good news, and again, this is incredibly interesting given the fact that we typically think of Gnosticism as being rather pessimistic. The good news is that basically everyone, all of mankind, is going to eventually achieve this kind of salvific knowledge. The only people that will ultimately be condemned are those that achieve Gnosis and then betray it or abandon it. According to the Apocryphon of John, basically everyone is eventually going to reach salvation. Again, the only kind of people that won't are those that achieve Gnosis and then betray it. Of course, Yaldabaoth isn't done with human beings yet. It attempts to wipe out all of human beings through the institution of fate, which can be resisted through spiritual powers. It attempts to destroy the line of Seth with a catastrophic flood, which the luminous epinoia actually informs Noah about. And eventually it institutes these demonic entities falling from the earth and mating with human women to somehow tempt human beings, although it's not exactly clear. Of course, this is the reference to the infamous Nephilim to be found in Genesis 6, but of course also spelled out in much greater detail in the Book of the Watchers, or the first book of Enoch. Following the description of the Nephilim, there's a kind of abrupt break where there appears the hymn of Pronoia. Now again, exactly how this hymn of Pronoia fits with the rest of the text isn't clear. Many scholars think that the hymn of the Pronoia, or divine providence, is actually an earlier document that is fused onto the end of the Apocryphon of John. However, what we have is a story in which the Pronoia has descended 3 times into this sort of chaotic abyss of physical reality, and it is only on the 3rd occasion that the Pronoia was able to awaken human beings from their ignorance and thus begin the process of salvation. It is in fact in that 3rd awakening that Pronoia baptizes humankind with a kind of 5-fold baptism, inaugurating the process of their salvation. If you're interested, I've actually made a separate video from another Gnostic text in which that baptism, or a baptism somewhat like it, it's a 3-fold baptism as opposed to a 5-fold baptism, but I've made another video in which Gnostic baptism rituals are actually described at some length. So if you're interested in the ritual side of Gnostic Christianity, you may want to check out my episode on Gnostic baptism rituals. However, it's still not clear exactly how this final hymn of the Pronoia fits exactly with the rest of the Apocryphon of John. However, scholars have detected something very interesting about the long recension of the Apocryphon of John. It seems that the threefold cycle of the hymn of the Pronoia has actually influenced exactly the way that the long recension has been restructured over and against the shorter recension. It seems that the short recension may have been edited into its final form, or at least the form we have in the long recension, along the lines of the hymn of the Pronoia, where the hymn of the Pronoia is somehow imposing its threefold structure onto the Apocryphon of John itself. Although exactly how all that works out is a bit mysterious, I'll include a great study about just this topic in the description below if you're interested. Needless to say, the Apocryphon of John is a mythological tour de force and contains many of the elements that are typically thought to be Gnostic. Though I want to point out something that I think is very important in any discussion of the Apocryphon of John. While the Apocryphon of John is a really important surviving mythological story found in Gnostic Christianity, it is by no means the only form of this kind of myth. In fact, there's another version of exactly this myth to be found in the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit, sometimes referred to as the Gospel of the Egyptians. So even the version of this myth with the Barbelo cycle and the Sethianism is not exhausted by the Apocryphon of John. There are other versions of this myth. And further, there are other versions of early Christian mythology that we would now call Gnostic, for instance that of Valentinus, that can be found in the Gospel of Truth. In the Valentinian mythology, to be found again in the Gospel of Truth, is an entirely different mythological structure. In fact, it leans much more heavily on Middle Platonism than does this Barbelo mysticism, which seems to be at least distantly Jewish in character. So while the mythology developed in the Apocryphon of John is incredibly important for understanding the development of what we might call Gnostic Christianity in the ancient world, one should not confuse this form of mythology with all of Gnostic mythology at all. Further, and you'll notice that I use the word Gnostic in a rather provisional way throughout this episode. That's because even by studying a text like the Apocryphon of John, which is taken to be typically Gnostic by many people, if you study the text carefully, it actually disrupts many of the stereotypes that one often has about Gnosticism. For instance, it's often thought that Gnosticism is radically dualistic with a deep hatred of the physical world, including the physical body, and that extends into a kind of radical asceticism, especially downplaying sexuality. But that's simply not true if we study the Apocryphon of John rather closely. Of course, the physical world is thought to be fundamentally evil, but notice that the primordial human being, along with Chava, or life, actually only are able to persist by having sexual intercourse and producing Seth, and it's only by the production of Seth that the epinoia, the salvific knowledge that one can reach through Gnostic religion, is actually passed down through the ages, reaching eventually maybe people like us. Again, while the physical world is thought by the Apocryphon of John to be fundamentally a kind of prison, it's actually through sexual intercourse that the epinoia is passed down, such that all of later people can actually reach Gnosis and escape it. So we have a kind of tension, where there is a kind of anti-physical dualism operating here, but at the same time, it does not by extension logically lead to a kind of anti-body, radical, anti-sexual intercourse asceticism. And as you can see, by carefully studying a text like the Apocryphon of John, many of these simplistic ideas like dualism, hatred of the body, anti-physicality, these kinds of ideas break down or at least become very problematic if you study these texts very closely. And this is why scholars have increasingly thought to think about Gnosticism as a much more complex kind of interplay of ideas rather than a body of intellectual or spiritual beliefs held by people in antiquity. Now, before I make an episode specifically detailing the criticisms of the concept of Gnosticism, I want to make a few more episodes covering some of these texts, because you can't really criticize a category without laying that category out, at least in some detail. So in some sense, I'm trying to balance out two competing elements while making these episodes on Gnosticism. I'm laying out Gnostic ideas and Gnostic texts while saying that modern scholars are pretty skeptical of these categories. So we have to hold both of these at the same time if we want to treat this material in a responsible way. Another and perhaps final thing worth pointing out about the Apocryphon of John is to notice just how radically advanced of a theological text this is, given its position in the development of Christianity. If we date this text to between 100 and 185 of the Common Era, it is positively shocking how much ground this text covers. Here we have a highly developed negative theology, a very complex economy of the inner life and development of the Godhead, an explanation of the profusion of heavenly entities, including Christ, along with an origin story about the very nature of evil itself. We have an interesting account of why there's a physical world at all. How did the physical world get here if everything began as a spiritual world? And further, we're given an incredibly epic story about just how that physical world can be escaped. And finally, there's this amazing hymn of the Pronoia, which describes the structure of that salvation being played out through history. I mean, this is incredible. The Apocryphon of John covers an enormous array of philosophical, spiritual, and salvific ideas. It's a positive tour de force. And again, if we date this text to around 100 to 180 of the Common Era, this is decisively before the rise of the great Christian theologians, people like Athanasius. So this text, if it is from that early time period, is incredibly advanced from a philosophical, spiritual, and Christological viewpoint. And while the Apocryphon of John is intellectually dense and theologically complex, it's also worth noting just how hopeful the text is. The story is all about how a cosmic mistake is corrected and how human beings can achieve salvation, maybe even all human beings at some level. Notice that the text is incredibly hopeful. And again, this disrupts some of the ideas that people typically ascribe to so-called Gnosticism, with its obsession of the evil of physicality or the horrifying nightmarish Yaldabaoth. This text is fundamentally about hope, and it ends again with the hymn of the Pronoia on exactly that positive note. This text is amazingly hopeful, again disrupting some of the more stereotypical ideas that are typically ascribed to so-called Gnosticism. And it's for all these reasons that I've listed and more that I really do think that the Apocryphon of John, or the secret teaching of John, is the absolute best place for a person to begin their study of Gnosticism and Gnostic literature. You get a solid overall sense of the Gnostic myth structure, you get a very detailed theory of salvation, along with some of the more subtle aspects that also go to disrupt the category of Gnosticism itself. So this text allows you to get an entryway into the very complex theology of Gnosticism and also begin the process of undermining that concept at the same time. It's incredibly dynamic if you give it a very careful study. If you're interested in Gnosticism, Hermetic philosophy, or mystical theology, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica. These are all core content items on our channel. And further, if you want to support my work of making accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in Western esotericism here on YouTube, please consider supporting my work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. Your contributions to this channel make it possible for me to continue doing this work. Thank you very much. As you might imagine, the Apocryphon of John, since its discovery in the late 19th century, has generated an enormous amount of scholarship, and translations are widely available. In fact, the two principal translations of the Nag Hammadi library are both wonderful, and in some sense I recommend you get both. They really color the text in slightly different ways, they read slightly differently, and these texts are so affordable that having both editions on your shelf is eminently doable. So I'd really recommend getting both editions of the Nag Hammadi library and studying the text there relatively closely, including the Apocryphon of John. I'll also say that the translation of Stephen Davies is also well worth considering. It translates the text in a kind of free verse which really accentuates the literary and poetic qualities of the text without sacrificing any of the scholarly content. So this is a really incredible translation, especially if you want to appreciate the Apocryphon of John from a more poetic or literary point of view. And of course, it also has a facing commentary, which helps to illuminate a lot of the very complex elements that are going on in the text. So the Davies translation is really nice from a literary point of view, although you can also, of course, consult both translations to be found in both major editions of the Nag Hammadi Library in English, which again are also incredibly scholastic and well worth having. The most comprehensive study of the Apocryphon of John has been done by Karen King, and she also produces a translation of all the various recensions of the Apocryphon of John. And I have to say, this kind of scholarship is what I die for. It is such good scholarship, very carefully researched, and also incredibly readable. It's really, really lovely. So this text by Karen King is absolutely worth getting, and surprisingly, it's not published by Brill, so it's actually affordable. And I think you can even get it used for sometimes like $10 or $12 American. It is well worth having if you are interested in Gnosticism, or if you're studying the Apocryphon of John, especially for the first time. This is a quintessential text by Karen King. You absolutely must get it, and it is wonderful scholarship. So make sure to pick that up. I'll also say, if you just want an introduction to Gnosticism and Gnostic literature, my favorite text is Vanderbroek's Gnostic Religion and Antiquity. This is a really solid text. It covers a great deal of the Gnostic literature in a very compact way. It remains both very scholastic and very approachable. So this is a very solid text that deals with a lot of the subtleties of Gnosticism in a very highly academic way, but is very approachable. So I'd really, really recommend picking up his text as well. Further, if you'd like to learn to read a bit of Coptic, you can also pick up Thomas Lambden's Introduction to Sahidic Coptic. Sahidic Coptic is the principal classical Coptic language in which most of the Gnostic literature that we have survives in. Bohairic Coptic would become the later form of Coptic in the Coptic Orthodox Church, but in Lambden's text you learn to read Sahidic Coptic, and therefore you can begin to read many of the texts to be found in the Nag Hammadi Library, the Bruce Codex, etc. So if you want to learn to read some Coptic, which again, if you're going to study Gnosticism in any depth, you're going to want to do at some point, the Lambden text is relatively accessible, relatively inexpensive, and a really solid way to learn to read Coptic on your own. So I hope you found this introduction to the Apocryphon, or the secret teaching of John, interesting, and I hope you stay tuned for more episodes on Gnosticism. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.